Thank you, and a shout out to the Barr Foundation for funding this work as well. You've made a big difference in Boston, so thanks, Barr friends. So we really started almost from a standing start in Superstorm Sandy in 2012. We'd been really trying to prevent climate, not adapt for climate, and there was a big, Carl Spector was our person who was really focused on this, but many of us were really saying, we can't adapt yet, we need to keep trying to prevent climate. But Superstorm Sandy said it was too late to prevent everything. So this was the largest hurricane to ever hit the east coast of the United States. Most hurricanes are 300 miles long. This was 1,000 miles long, and what made it a superstorm is it ran into a nor'easter, which is why it suddenly veered west and made landfall at New York and New Jersey. Where it did so, it wreaked havoc with our transportation systems, our electrical grid, except for Goldman Sachs, which did not put its backup generator in the basement, our residential areas. But this is what Boston looked like the day of Superstorm Sandy. In fact, this is what Boston's going to look like this weekend when we have a king tide, which is the highest astronomical high tide of the year. So why such a difference? It wasn't really the distance between epicenter and Boston. It's why we flood. And before I started working on this research, I thought, oh, my poor theoretical grandchildren, what they'll have to deal with. It's not really like a spigot starts one day in the future, and before that we have no flooding. It's really about increasing probability over time based on three converging unfortunate stars. The first thing is storm surges. Like Superstorm Sandy, when you have a giant wind, it's going to push water in front of it. So that water will build up at the land's edge. The other thing is when you hear the weather person say it's a low barometric pressure day, it literally means there's less air pressure pushing down on the water. So even a calm, flat, foggy day, the sea level relatively will be higher. So an average storm surge for a winter storm for us is a couple feet, and our 100-year storm surge is 5 feet. Our 1,000-year storm, really, which is our maximum, is 6 feet. So we don't get really big storm surges in Boston Harbor. That's not true outside the harbor. So what we call locally wicked high tides, I was trying to call king tides wicked pissa high tides, but people got offended. So they're king tides. But wicked high tides is really when the sun and the moon are aligned, especially during a new moon, and they're pulling in the same direction, if you remember vector geometry from high school. So a wicked high tide is an extra foot during the month, a couple times a month, and then the highest high tide during the year is about 2.5 feet higher. And then underlying sea level rise. And the way I think of this is imagine a tantrumy kid in a bathtub. So if you knew that every time your kid went in the bathtub, he or she had a tantrum, you would be flood prepared. You'd only put a little bit of water in that bathtub and you would be fine. If you knew that your child was relentlessly calm, you could fill that bathtub to the highest level without fear. But if you had an unexpected flood event, you could have major coastal flooding. And that is the case with our coastal infrastructure, which is set in stone literally. And as the underlying level of the ocean goes up, the height of the storm that will overtop our bathtub or seawall is lower and lower. So this is really a convergence of reasons to flood. So let's go through those in turn. So New York to Boston, 200 miles as the crow flies, but that's not why New York had $60 billion of property damage and Boston barely noticed. One of the things is Boston, we're better in so many ways, says the parochial speaker, but really one of the reasons we're best is Boston Harbor. We are west of Stellwagen Bank, which is an underwater mountain range. If you ever go whale watching, that's where the whales hang out. It's an extraordinarily rich marine ecosystem. But that underwater mountain range also seriously decreases storm energy before it gets to the harbor. Then we have, thankfully, Winthrop and Hull. Thank you, Winthrop and Hull, taking one for the team, plus 34 harbor islands. So by the time a 30-foot wave out in Massachusetts Bay hits the aquarium, it's a 2-foot wave. So we have this extraordinary natural topography that so far obviates the need for a storm surge barrier because it is a storm surge barrier. Unlike New York, which unfortunately is a double funnel topographically. So first, remember, in this part of the world, we get nor'easters. Our storms come from the east. So look where that storm is coming from. North of Long Island Sound, you get a whole bunch of water pushed down the East River. South of Long Island Sound, you get a whole bunch of water pushed up New York Harbor, which is narrow, has almost no islands, and there's nowhere for that water to go but up on land. So as a result, for the same size storm, New York gets much higher storm surges. And in fact, where we really max out at about 6 feet, the worse the storm, the worse the flooding New York gets. So when people say, if Sandy had happened here, it really couldn't happen in the same way. We have different design challenges. For example, we're very close to the water. So this is the future site of GE World Headquarters. And as you can see, this is a sunny day with no wind. This was one of last fall's king tides, and where the GE site is literally at sea level. And that's before, we've already had a foot of sea level rise, probably a few more inches since the turn of the century, and we're already starting to flood during these astronomical high tides. This is the Dorchester Harbor Walk. Again, these are, no weather, just astronomical high tide. This is Long Wharf. A lot of our industrial sites are right next to the water with no seawalls. This is where our road salt is in Chelsea Creek. And this is a quote-unquote dry dock in Charlestown Navy Yard. But if you turn around, you see the entire Navy Yard is really that same elevation. So once that ocean overtops a not very high seawall, you start to see pretty extensive flooding. So tides, let's look at how that interacts with storm surges. This is the Coast Guard station in Lower Manhattan at the Battery. This is what it saw the day of Hurricane Sandy. That lowest oscillation is really the astronomical high tide. You could calculate that at 1,000 years. That's just based on the sun and the moon. The green line in the middle that goes up and down, that was Sandy's storm surge. Unfortunately, that peaked at high tide. Those two curves are additive. So the storm tide at Sandy was 14 feet above low tide. Their normal high tide is 4 to 5 feet above low tide. Nobody prepares for that. And that line across the top is the king tide height. This is our tide gauge at our Coast Guard station right next to the Children's Museum in Boston Harbor. And this is what Boston saw during Sandy. One of the first things you see is the curve's very different. We have a 10-foot tide, and New York has a 4-foot tide because of water sloshing back and forth between Cape Cod and Nova Scotia. We get a higher tide. So two things you see. One is that, remember that 1,000-year storm surge only gets to 6 feet. We don't even care unless our storm surge hits higher than mid-tide because we have such a big tide cycle. So between our islands and our big tide cycle, we luckily have this big natural protection from storm surges and coastal flooding. The other thing you see is that Superstorm Sandy, its storm surge peaked at low tide. After getting through all those barriers, it peaked at low tide, so all we saw was a little bit of flooding around the edges. Had that peaked at high tide, though, we would have seen a 100-year flood. So a 5.5-hour difference between major flooding and not is luck, not policy, right? So we do have to make some changes. The big issue that we are not protected from is sea level rise. So these difference in colors, this comes from Climate Ready Boston, which was an outstanding piece of work by the city with UMass Boston. The light blue, maybe it's lighter because it's less likely, is if we stop everything, go to elevators to stairs, cars to bikes, at a global level, we maybe will only see 2.5 feet of sea level rise in Boston. Relative sea level rise is the global average. It is different place to place depending on currents. It would be very hard to keep ourselves to that level. We are more likely to see between 2.5 and 7.5 feet of sea level rise in Boston. Why does that matter? Because a third of Boston floods at 7.5 feet. Those are all our filled tidelands. So this is what, this is, at this point feels like a cave painting. Our maps are so much better, but it does show flooding in Boston. These colors are all the places that flood at 7.5 feet above today's high tide. Why does it look like that? Because this is what early European settlers saw when they first came into Boston. And what they then did is they filled in all those shallow bays to give themselves more elbow room. They were mariners. They knew how protective the harbor was. They never contemplated sea level rise. So our design challenge in Boston is really, how do we keep the city vibrant, especially our transportation systems, much of which is subway within these areas? How do we stay vibrant as we ultimately have to move back to our original shoreline or some piece of it? So this is why I say those looked like cave paintings, because these are our current maps done by Woods Hole Group for MassDOT and UMass Boston for MassDOT. This is in fact what a 1% flood looks like, because it's a hydrodynamic model. Behind this very simple map is months of number crunching by a supercomputer that's looking at tides and a Monte Carlo simulation of all the different ways that storms can hit and the likelihood of those storms hitting at high tide. So a 1% storm today looks like this, just a little bit of flooding. A 1% storm mid-century looks like this, quite a bit more flooding, because we are so flat. So what floods mid-century? The Aquarium Tea Station. And why we are doing so much photographic recording of our wicked high tide, our king tide, is because that's what our normal high tide is going to look like sometime around mid-century. We're already seeing flooding in the Aquarium Tea Station through the vents at these king tides. JFK Station, plus the roads around it, big wave. It's a big environmental justice concern, both for the neighborhood, for UMass Boston. It's a major transportation corridor. We've been calling this the inundation district, but it's our innovation district. It is flat. It is filled. It didn't exist before the 1800s. And it's now billions of dollars of new development, including an underground Silver Line. Maverick Square up above does not flood, but its head house does, and a lot of the Blue Line. Again, that's how the North Shore gets into Boston and a lot of environmental justice communities. Sullivan Square also floods. So, this is, again, a 1% storm, what we used to call a 100-year storm before the environment started moving around. But that's, that is manageable as long as that is a rare occurrence. Okay, so what happens late century? And this is sort of 2070 and on, because we have a lot of uncertainty both on human behavior and modeling. So sometime late century, some of us will still be quite alive at this point. You start to get quite a bit of flooding. I'm not going to show pictures. I'm just going to show the T. And we did a great job of putting the T right in some places that are going to flood chronically, right? Because if this is a 100-year storm, there's a lot of flooding that's going to happen on a monthly basis as well. So, because again, we're so flat, there's not a big difference between our monthly flood and our 100-year flood. So by late century, we're going to need to adapt. We're going to probably need to take a lot of our subway out of the subway in order to still get around. City of Boston has not been slacking. Shout out to the folks in the city and the state who have already been working on this. So within a couple years of Sandy, we had a climate action plan update that totally focused on preparedness. Before that, it had really been focusing on mitigation. The next year out came Climate Ready Boston and Imagine Boston 2030, which really focused on how do we, over the next 15 years, learn about what to do. These are big, expensive investments. It makes sense to do some thinking before we do those investments. And now the city is starting to do implementation with these. I think of these as proto-regulations, saying when you're building new buildings or doing major retrofits, let's talk about preparing for maybe 5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the year, which I think is pretty appropriate. And that comment period is happening right now. Please weigh in. The city is also putting out RFPs for some of the lowest lying areas where we get our initial flood pathways to say, how can we both block that flooding and do some other good while we're at it. And the city is, for the first time, putting into its capital budget expenditures for climate preparedness. So the city is starting to mobilize. Though I am more of a coastal expert than rainfall, I want people to keep in mind this is not just coastal, so if you're inland, you have to think about some things as well. This area's, not just Boston, but New England's rainfall and rain intensity have gone up by 10% since the 60s. Our pipes have not gone up 10% since the 60s. And the issue is not average range, it's these big pulses. They call them cloudbursts sometimes. We're having these flash floods of really intense rain in 6 hours, 12 hours. And we're having these flash droughts like last summer where we only had 8 inches of rain in 4 months, and our plants can't deal and our rivers can't deal with that little amount of rainfall. So we're getting much lumpier precipitation, and our infrastructure doesn't expect that to happen. So we get these funny no-name storms. Who remembers Framingham flooding a couple of years ago? They do, but this was barely made the newspapers. Who remember Falls River's infrastructure getting wrecked a few years ago? I don't, but particularly our low-lying neighborhoods, our older cities with smaller infrastructure, they can't do this alone. It's too expensive to increase those pipes. This is about watershed protection upriver. This is about a lot of storm swales and integrated climate preparedness. This is a long-term issue we're dealing with. And finally, it's getting hotter. So when you say, no problem, use a bike path. If you're wearing a suit and it's 100 degrees, you're not going to use the bike path. Even if you really care. I am one of those people. We used to have 11 days above 90 degrees historically. Last summer it was twice that. I stopped using my bike during that heat wave. So as we're dealing with transportation, how people deal with that heat matters as well. Plus the people who don't have air conditioning, don't have access to cooling off. Right now, we look like Boston. Mid-century, we could look like Baltimore. By the end of the century, we could look like Birmingham, Alabama. Poor Birmingham, Alabama towards the end of the century. So we're getting hotter as well. So finally, what do you do about all of this? When you look at flooding, the Dutch know flooding. They are the Netherlands for a reason. They basically say you need to have a belt and suspenders approach. You need some kind of regional barrier. It could be a harbor barrier. It could be Boston's dry line along the waterfront of awesome elevated parks. But you can't have the water sloshing in and out. When that fails, and it will as oceans get higher, you need a floodable transition zone. That could be a salt marsh, that could be a plaza. When that fails, and it will, you need to be able to batten down the hatches for your building so that salt water doesn't get in and corrode things. When that fails, and it will, you need to move. And that could be upstairs or uphill. What we've been really talking about a lot is the idea of living with water. We don't have to keep every drop of water out. We just try to keep it away from our fine art, from people, from subways, because salt water is very corrosive. But people like to live near water where it's not harming people. It's cheaper, it's more beautiful, and it can solve double duty. When you think about flood control not being a single ugly levee, but how can water interact in safe ways? So for example, in all of our work, we've learned 5 basic things. One is you don't have to do everything today. Water's moving over time. It's not like an earthquake where it all happens at once. Here's a levee that is also doubling as a gorgeous park. So Hafen City in Hamburg, they have to deal with big river storm surges. All of this plaza floods before their streets do and their buildings do. But meanwhile, they've got an awesome park. Double duty solutions, again, that become great public space, and so this is Chungachung Channel in Seoul, South Korea. This is what it looks like during their rainy season. Obviously, people don't go down there, but look at the streets around it. They're not flooded. Similar to the Charles River, also in Seoul, they've got green space on either side of the river. This is what it looks like during the rainy season, and their highways are still going. So this idea of, how can you create awesome open space that can flood? Bus rapid transit is an obvious design for resilience. just drive the buses away from a flood as opposed to trying to block off a subway tunnel. So this is not only great for carbon constraint, for getting more people around, it's also outstanding for flooding. Couple more slides. It's not all building out of it, it's getting people to work together. This is a rural area where the neighbors were taking care of their elders for public health reasons. They had a giant flood. None of those elders died because the village agents were right there making sure they had medicine and fresh food and fresh water and information. And they made this program permanent after the flood receded. And finally, predict where you're going to flood. You can do something about it beforehand. The Netherlands has 30 parts of their river systems that overtop their banks. This is a 2,000-year-old city. We can do this. We're only 400 years old. They cut a new channel, and look how they dropped their normal river level, so they no longer flood during these intense rainfalls. We can do this too. That was a lot. If you only remember 3 things, here they are. Unless at a global level we get better than business as usual carbon emissions, 1/3 of Boston could flood by the end of the century. There are people alive today who will see that. Because of this, regardless of whether it's 3 feet or 7.5 feet, we're going to have a lot of flooding. Boston has to be different. It doesn't have to be worse. So as we spend the money on flood control, we should also address other issues, including carbon-constrained transportation, including awesome open space, including affordable housing, so that we make every dollar count twice. Thank you very much.